how the human being can increase his or her physical energy level in everyday life.
Creation energy symbol energy.
Please note that the information provided is only a customizable advisory and not a professional medical treatise and cannot replace any necessary medication. Therefore, if it is required, then medical advice is to be sought and any necessary medication taken. However, the very best way and the behavior connected with that is always the clear and conscious self-help in the form that the human being does not give in to the whining, but always moves with all limbs correctly and uses his or her own energy and its power in order to stay fit at all times.
If the human being really wants to increase his or her energy level, then he or she shall not be influenced by listlessness or tiredness, but disregard it and become active. Of course, he or she needs sleep, and enough of it, but too much is unhealthy and inhibits the necessary function of his or her mental activity and the body along with its entire organism. The omission of this much-needed activity inevitably results in the body becoming rusty, stiff, and the entire organism becoming weak and susceptible to maladies. This, as well as that all the important mental processes become disadvantaged, because the world of thoughts moves in a paralyzing wise, and slowly but surely falls prey to negative paths, whereby the danger arises that sooner or later the human being will begin to stir and be disturbed by depression, anxiety, unworthy modes of behavior, and confused trains of thought. However, this leads to the fact that altogether everything corporeal and organic becomes susceptible to harmful bacteria and viruses, because the whole thing inevitably leads to the immune system weakening and no longer being able to protect the organism from bacteria, viruses, as well as other pathogens. This means that diseases develop that can become chronic or even life-threatening, or inevitably even result in death. Increasing the energy level and not being constantly lethargic, lacking in drive and tired, requires the human being to help themselves and to work on gaining more energy and power in everyday life, and to do so consciously in order to feel better over the long term. However, if energy levels are to be increased for mental function and for the organism and body, it is first necessary to understand which factors influence physical energy and power in everyday life. But these factors are not which energy foods to buy or other edible energy products, because such foodstuffs are not what the human being needs and are not what we are talking about. Such products are only valuable for energy and power expenditure in relation to the body, thus in relation to sports activities and performance, etc., but not for supplying the mental sphere with energy and power so that it can function fully. So when we talk about energy and power as well as their effects, then we are talking about both mental and physical aspects, because the influence of the energy level is therefore very important on both a mental as well as physical level. Often the physical and mental feeling of having no more energy arises in the human being. However, if he or she does not feel fulfilled and well, then this is usually due to the fact that the value of his or her energy level and its power in terms of the moral and physical condition has dropped and fallen to a level that somehow makes him or her immobile, sluggish. This is usually the moment when the human being, for example, readily resorts to eating less or eating heavier nutrient-rich foods, possibly not sleeping as well, or moving sparingly and arduously. All of this, in turn, can make us feel listless and lethargic, lacking in drive. The causes for these kinds of thoughts and feelings usually lie in wandering around purposelessly and empty-headed, and thus completely forgetting to maintain the necessary heedfulness for all and everything. The following descriptions are intended, in the right way, to make you feel better as a human being, and especially in terms of health, activity, and therefore active in the long term, and to actually be healthy as well. Consequently, what is to be said and explained is intended to enlighten the human being and to help him or her gain more energy and power in everyday life. It shall explain what it is that influences the energy level and what increases it. So it is first necessary to understand which factors influence the energy and power in everyday life. Energy and its power, as already mentioned, are to be understood both mentally and also physically. Therefore, in line with this, the thoughts, that is to say, the world of thoughts, and thus the factor of that which is mental, as well as of the body itself with its entire organism, are to be taken into account. Accordingly, the self-thinking human being, if he or she is not mentally or physically impaired, can determine both his or her overall condition. That is to say, that of the mentality, as well as that of the body, as well as influence his or her energy level and its power on all levels, and regulate them as well as his or her condition of the psyche. As far as the condition of the psyche is concerned, the human being must be clearly conscious of the fact regarding this, that the psychiatric psychological teachings regarding the psyche are invalid and wrong, because the psyche is neither an organ of the body, nor can the psyche be influenced by any medication, such as psychotropic drugs, etc. This is because there is no such thing as a psyche, only a condition of the psyche that is formed from the thoughts and feelings. In the 17th century, the word psyche was erroneously taken from the ancient Greek psyche, eidos, although in truth this term means breath, whiff and breathe, which was already used by philosophers in old or ancient Greece as life, soul, mind, and life power, etc., but had nothing to do with it in the sense of thoughts and feelings, as well as their values of positivity and negativity. The thoughts and feelings that define the state of consciousness according to their kind, that is to say, positivity or negativity, have nothing to do with the equalizedness or unequalizedness of a psyche, because such a thing does not exist. Truthfully, thoughts define themselves according to their kind as good, peaceful, equalized, and sublime, etc., if they have the value of the positive. However, if the values of the thoughts are negative, then this leads to depression, behavioral disorders, and ungood as well as unequalized as also other negative disorders. Erroneously, and due to a lack of knowledge about the function of the effects of the human consciousness and the world of thoughts, etc., the psychiatric and psychological sciences claim something that they really do not understand. Now, the truth, in fact, is that the thought world of the human being forms and consistently controls his or her consciousness in a life conduct-based wise, provided it shows no physiological, malformed, organic, or other damage, and indeed solely by the fact that the thought world of the human being, that is to say his or her thoughts, determine all the activities of consciousness. This is always only in a positive or negative wise, namely depending on how the thought world, that is to say, the human being's thoughts are natured, take shape, and then are brought about, and indeed in every case, and without exception, always in the form of the positive or negative. Namely, the thoughts form and characterize the feelings, which largely determine the actions, the mode of behavior, and the most varied character traits, etc., which are expressed in a thought-feeling-based, word-based, or action-based wise. This, for example, in positive forms of fairness, being analytical, fullness of imagination, being diligent, cheerfulness, flexibility, being charming, altruism, ambitiousness, down-to-earthness, empathy, modesty, being charismatic, honesty, being disciplined, thoughtfulness, strength of character, assertiveness, ambition and being relaxed, etc. Although some negative and therefore bad and damage-bringing characteristics should also be mentioned, such as perfectionism, laziness, recklessness, maliciousness, lustfulness for murder, non-thinking, unreflectiveness, disorientation, directionlessness, impudence, hostility, inconsiderateness, arrogance, being unpunctual, being impatient. Depending on how the human being cultivates his or her thought world or thoughts, in a positive or negative wise, he or she thereby also forms his or her feelings, and with them determines his or her modes of behavior and so forth. In this way, he or she determines his or her high life or low life, whether he or she is good, cheerful, full of joie de vivre, etc., ungood, depressive, maladjusted, or evil. And from all of this, the human being also forms his or her character and his or her nature. Consequently, he or she becomes a choleric, strong-willed, direct, and passionate person, or a more sanguine, extroverted, schnorrer, talkative, or optimistic person. He or she also, however, has the possibility of being as a melancholic type, a human being of distrust, of introversion or sensitivity, or being phlegmatic, a human being of neatness, orderliness, diplomacy, and reliability. But now more regarding the psyche, because it still must be said that there is no such thing, but that nevertheless and nonetheless the psychiatric lobby and the medical profession administer psychotropic drugs to the psychically ill, chemical products that are to be classified as poison one way or another, although these only have an anesthetic effect on the consciousness, which is incapacitated, so to speak, and forced to calm down. This means that the human being who is given or treated with such pharmaceuticals is immobilized with regard to his or her consciousness, so that he or she can only use it in a muted way for thought work and can no longer work with it to the full extent of his or her capability. There is also truthfully no psyche, that is to say, no organ that corresponds to a psyche, because what is called psyche is only a condition, namely the condition of the psyche, which is formed by that which is positive and negative of the thoughts and feelings. This means that the more positively a human being manages and controls his or her world of thoughts, the more equalized, that is to say, euthymic and healthier, the feelings develop, and thus also the so-called condition of the psyche. Human beings who are resilient in such a way react much less sensitively to all and every kind of stress. As a result, they deal with frustration, crises, sorrow, stress, anger, and tension, and so forth, much more easily and digest everything much better and faster than human beings who are plagued by a negative world of thoughts. They are not burdened by excessive demands, overwhelming anxiety, feelings of helplessness or loneliness, which has a positive effect on their metabolism, immune system, and organs. Their sleep is not disturbed, and their muscles are also protected from cramps, etc. The human being with a positive thought world acts much more flexibly in difficult and changing situations than a human being with a negative thought world. The healthy thought world of the human being has much more energy and therefore power of resistance to cope with anything negative than a human being with a negative thought world, and whose psychic condition falls prey to miserability. The human being with a healthy and positive thought world fosters visions of the future and knows exactly what he or she can and wants to achieve. Consequently, he or she also creates determinations, zela, in his or her sense, and knows that he or she can achieve them and will be successful if he or she makes an effort to achieve them. His or her self-consciousness and self-confidence are very strong, but never in boastfulness, but in equalizedness and humaneness. The system of his or her human perception and thinking is pronounced, and so is the entirety of his or her feeling impulsations and creational energetical processes. He or she also has a sober and optimistic mode of thinking, as well as the capability of a healthy and always active stress management, as well as a healthy mode of life. He or she makes a conscious effort to achieve everything and is characterized by the fact that he or she always has his or her objectives Zila in mind, strives for them, and knows about his or her own success, which increases his or her self-confidence, as well as the certain probability that he or she will achieve his or her determinations, Zila. However, the opposite effect to the healthy condition of the psyche, and thus a negative effect, comes about when the thought world is managed negatively, resulting in a negative condition of the psyche through which the joy of living sinks and the whole thing can lead up to suicide. What it means, however, when it is said that the human being is psychically ill, and so-called psychical disorders as well as psychical behavioral disorders occur, then this can be explained in such a way that a negative thought world is constantly or very intensively maintained for a long time. As a result, negative and therefore bad deviations from the norm of healthy normal thought patterns occur, causing the healthy norm of well-being and behavior to dissolve. The resulting wrongness of the thoughts and the feelings that arise from them very quickly become predominant, whereby the wrong and negative thoughts and feelings literally become the order of the day, which is described by those affected as the experience of hell, and which precisely forms the condition of the psyche all around. The negative condition of the psyche is the result of the cause of wrong, negative thoughts and feelings, in which feelings are formed by the thoughts, and indeed in each case, depending on how they are formed, that is to say, how they are, namely positive or negative. Hence, positive thoughts create positive feelings, while negative thoughts unavoidably create negative feelings. Their effects are correspondingly such that positive or negative outcoming effects take place accordingly. Thus, a negative or positive condition of the psyche is also formed. Hence, the human being feels good, satisfied, and well when the condition of the psyche is formed in a positive frame. However, if the condition of the psyche forms in a negative frame, then the human being feels ungood, unsatisfied, ill, and unwell, and so on. A right and all-around positive thought world, and therefore positive thoughts, have a positive effect on both the mental as well as the organic and general physical health. The healthy, positive thought world lowers stress levels very noticeably and very positively promotes the life attitude in an optimistic form, as well as strengthening the immune system and thereby reducing the susceptibility to illnesses. Any positive world of thoughts therefore promotes self-healing powers, and indeed in any case in such a way that the entire bodily organism renews or repairs many different kinds of cells. So as far as psychical disorders are concerned, such as misuse, abuse of medication, depression, states of anxiety, levels of fear, drug and alcohol abuse, as well as other pathological cravings and so forth, these are purely thought and feeling-based as well as behavioral in origin. In this respect, there is no organ such as a psyche or the like that would determine or give rise to an instability and an addiction. Because truthfully, it is always and in every case only the world of thoughts that is decisive for the fact that a distinct condition of well-being or unwellness arises. An addiction and such like arises from the world of thoughts alone, because it is only through the thought world that something is created and brought to effect, in which case the feelings are also created or formed by it. It is therefore obviously wrong that deviations from experience and behavior are referred to as psychical disorders or mental disorders, because there is no psyche, but only a condition of the psyche, which is defined in this way because there is currently no other term for thoughts and feelings as well as their effects, nor would it be understandable for the earthling at the present time. Negative thoughts and feelings, which have got out of the control of a good kind or form, is actually a disorder of the consciousness, which erroneously and in unknowledge of the effective facts of understanding what the consciousness really is called a personality disorder, although this is a further falsification. The personality is a formation of the consciousness, which also determines the genetic makeup of the person, as well as all physical characteristics and thus the external appearance, but also the state of the immune system and thus the health of the body and its organs, the intelligentum being intelligent, and the capability of thought connected with it and its mode, the neuroticism and the openness, the cognitive capability, the creativity and the perception capability, learning ability, imagination capability, decision-making ability, knowledge ability, conscience capability, extroversion ability, the important introversion ability, the agreeableness capability, the enthusiasm capability, the ambition and optimism, the curiosity, or the emotional stability, with regard to the sensitiveness and so forth, as well as all other cognitive capabilities. The most common causes for too low of an energy level in human beings are undisputedly the following. Too little daylight as a result of night work, light shyness, dark workplaces, etc., lack of fulfillment in everyday life with regard to daily duties, due to constant distractions, time wasting or malaise, etc., lack of fulfillment in regular work tasks due to overwork or incapability, insufficient rest periods for reflection and recuperation, a frequent disregard when it comes to personal self-care, an unbalanced and unvaried diet, poor nutritional supply for the metabolism due to an undersupply of micronutrients and fluids, frequent calorie deficits due to incorrect or inadequate nutrition, suffering from lack of physical activity, such as due to frequent sitting and lying down, no walking movements and body movements, etc., frequent lack of sleep, although the reason for this is not relevant. Too high demands on oneself that cannot be met. Lack of consonance with one's own understanding and ability. Lack of consonance with one's own wishes and their realization. Lack of consonance with one's own energy, strengths, and values. Lack of consonance with managing one's own striving for perfectionism. Lack of consonance with excessive endeavors and special interests. Lack of consonance with one's own mindfulness, which is only perceived inadequately and therefore everything is heedlessly twisted by the wind and never really perceived, as well as not defined as true, but always wrongly held as belief and misunderstood as such. Constantly ignoring one's own inner clock, thus being unpunctual, inflammatorily agitated against oneself and unsatisfied. Having a lack of self-esteem and therefore heedlessly subordinating oneself to others, subserviently, believingly, foolishly, and therefore pseudo-thinkingly, that is to say, non-thinkingly. Living in a phlegmatic, inactive, unconcerned, sluggish, apathetic, and stolid wise, as well as purposelessly. To lead one's life in a dissolute manner, as a result of alcohol, drugs, work shyness, non-thinking, criminality and laziness, etc. There are, of course, many reasons for this, which make human beings listless and lacking in drive and lead them to be an outsider among those who are full of energy, thus from those human beings who are always on the ball and active. Consequently, the 21 points mentioned are just a few of all those reasons that give or cause human beings to have a lower and weaker level of energy. For example, if a human being has just overcome an illness or a serious accident from which they need to recover, it is completely normal for him or her to struggle with it acutely. So the whole thing is to be evaluated and understood completely differently. Namely, that in such a situation it is natural and completely normal to be absolutely different, not normal, and therefore also weaker than usual. If the human being also feels exceptionally exhausted over a longer period of time, 10 days or more, and can only concentrate on something with difficulty, then it is time for him or her to seriously think about what might be wearing them out so much. However, if the human being does not find what is wrong in himself or herself as an affliction of an illness, in order to tackle it and change it for the better, which must always be the first step, because he or she is always closest to himself or herself, so that he or she can first and foremost reflect and realize that he or she shall help himself or herself and be expressly proactive in order to deal with everything. He or she shall therefore be clear and conscious of the fact that they shall always at first try to help themselves and above all, not to be sniveling. And only then, if he or she is not able to do so, it is time to have a medical examination in order to rule out more serious illnesses or consequences of accidents and so on. In order for the human being to be able to increase his or her energy level, he or she first of all consciously needs his or her own determination and will to really and willingly work on increasing it in order to clearly and again consciously include the holistic approach of his or her mental factors in his or her efforts. In doing so, he or she should pay attention to the following points and actually implement them, so that he or she really manages to develop more energy and power for the effective needs of his or her activities in everyday life. It is required that full attentiveness is directed to what shall be done in order to increase the energy level. By the human being perceiving himself or herself better and rightly according to the truth in everyday life, he or she shall feel himself or herself again, and fathom out which important things in his or her daily life rob him or her of energy. He or she shall fathom within himself or herself how and when he or she can really rebuild his or her energy, namely whether he or she can do this through an appropriate lively conversation, through meditation, a certain activity, through breathing exercises, strolling or some other kind of rest and relaxation, etc. He or she shall prepare himself or herself for the fact that at the moment in the here and now, he or she can only be himself or herself, and shall leave aside his or her thoughts about what occupies and burdens him or her by those thoughts. Regular daily exercise not only hardens the body and increases the ability to keep energy levels high, and indeed, even if sometimes it would seem counterproductive at the first moment when the human being feels lacking in motivation and tired. An active lifestyle is the measure of all things, thus also for the consciousness-based and physical energy levels and their power in everyday life. Walks, as also a few physical exercises, as well as good and valuable thoughts, not pseudo-thoughts or beliefs, can beneficially improve blood circulation throughout the body, even if this is not known to the sciences. Just like any physical activity and real thoughts also supply the brain well and more effectively with oxygen. This effectuates that all cells do their job much better and can therefore build up and release more energy in return. It is primarily not necessary that the corresponding movements take place continuously one after the other, because everything can also be carried out with minor interruptions. This simply has to be done in such a way that it is continued and not given up on, because the movement must be continued again and again, so it should not be given up on and ended. The energy levels will only increase if the right kind of movement is maintained and continued in the right form. The right movements can really boost energy. But if everything is done incorrectly or misapplied, for example, when an overexertion takes place, then everything quickly develops into the opposite and becomes a real energy guzzler. That's why the right form of exercise is very important, as well as the right measure, which therefore requires that the human being does everything with logic, intellect, as well as rationality, and does not overdo it. Consequently, it is also required that the human being builds up basic endurance, which means that he or she commits a minimum amount of time to physical activity. Through the movements, he or she puts his or her body through a change by using his or her muscles in such a wise that he or she brings everything to a cellular level, so to speak, namely by mobilizing more mitochondria, which are oval or tubular tiny structures about the same size as viruses and are the actual energy suppliers in the cells. This effectively changes the body at a cellular level, which activates new blood vessels, so to speak, and results in a better supply of oxygen. It even turns out that the heart changes in such a way that it is able to deliver more oxygen. As a result, the whole body is supplied with oxygen more effectively, and at the same time is more efficient in its use, which not only leads to higher performance, but also means that more energy can be effectively created and better utilized. However, if the human being does too little in this respect, then he or she will atrophy in terms of energy, and an increase in energy level cannot take place. If the human being does too much of a good thing, then he or she overloads his or her body and heart, as a result of which he or she cannot sufficiently regenerate. As a result, he or she loses his or her energy and possibly even his or her life prematurely. In order to increase energy levels in the long term, it is absolutely necessary for the human being to keep moving in a controlled manner, as a mixture of alternating movement and rest is required. A basic duration of movement, as well as a basic duration of rest, is required to keep the body and its entire circulatory system in constant regulation, although it is also necessary to tackle intense peaks of exertion at appropriate intervals, but never to overdo it. The energies and powers clearly and precisely reveal how far and intensively one may go in order to avoid harm. Thus, energy and power also indicate how long the human being shall be active and recover from it again. The body and its energy and power also make it possible to recognize when it is the right time to deal with it as best and properly as possible, as well as when it is necessary to really relax and for how long. The circadian rhythm, that is to say, the regular alternation of rest and movement, determines which physical processes take place at what times of the day and at night, and consequently which hormones are also required and released, when food is required and when it is to be digested. In this way, the energy demand is also determined, which then determines the energy level and the power, which in turn is closely connected with the circadian rhythm. The human being is probably still a little tired when he or she wakes up in the morning, but a short time later he or she is usually wide awake, accustomed to life and also active. At a certain time, he or she then feels fully awake, productively aligns himself or herself according to his or her energy and power and concentration, until at some point when his or her energy and power drops off again. This is a completely natural process, just as a good night's sleep ensures a good energy level the next day. For each human being, however, everything is a little different, so therefore the personal circadian rhythm of one human being is different from the next one. And if this is understood, then it is also easier to manage one's own or the next one's energy and power, and not to overtax them, but also to use one's own or the next one's energy and power in the right way, and perhaps even to increase it. The circadian rhythm helps the human being to better perceive himself or herself and his or her time for this and that, as well as to become more familiar with all his or her duties at certain times, which may even lead to practical hints as to when the most efficient time is, when something should be done, when to take a break, or when to go to sleep. Nutrition is a very important and essential building block for human beings and their energy and power in order to be able to exist at all, as well as to combat any arising lack of drive, motivation, reluctance, and fatigue. Namely, it is only when the human being supplies his digestive organs with sufficient nutrients that he or she can demand a good energy level from his or her organism and body. Therefore, the human being should take cognizance of the following things and explanations. Observe them and follow them. It is necessary that the body is always supplied with sufficient calories and carbohydrates through all kinds of food. Long-term diets cause problems for the body over time, because the body does not receive enough of the various most necessary substances, minerals, vitamins, and other substances of all kinds with specific nutritional or physiological effects, to fully create the required energy and power of the entire organism. A balanced and varied diet with many different and complex carbohydrates, important and sufficient proteins, unsaturated fats, and sufficient other manifold substances is required to maintain the entire bodily organism. The need for carbohydrates is particularly high during hard work, and the effect of carbohydrates is very important, and above all, they must not be underestimated. Meals should contain plenty of fruit and vegetables, and care should also be taken to ensure that as wide a variety of foods as possible is consumed. Fast food or quick meals, convenience food, should be avoided because 1. They contain a lot of fat and sugar, as well as other fattening and unhealthy chemical substances, many of which are also pathogenic, such as carcinogenic, etc. Special attention should be paid to the intake of micronutrients, as these are of particular importance for a good and healthy organism, namely vitamins, minerals, and trace elements. Of particular importance and relevant for the entire organism of the body, and thus also for the energy level, are especially B vitamins, vitamin D, iron, magnesium, and coenzyme Q10. Meals that are too fatty, too sugary, and too heavy should always and in any case be avoided. It should be ensured that the circadian rhythm is observed for the enjoyment of meals, because the regularity of meal times contributes greatly to the health of the entire organism of the body. Sleep patterns and regular bedtimes are important, as is the rest period of sleep, which should be regulated to at least 7 to 8 hours per sleep period. The tips for this are given by the personal everyday behavior, such as when the personally right moment or the right time for sleeping is, how the course of the day and the work and other activities are divided, according to which the bedtime is determined. Healthy and sufficient sleep is important and guarantees the necessary alertness and the proper functioning of the body. But above all, the required energy level to live everyday life in the right wise with all its ups and downs, and to be able to survive unharmed. Provided that the necessary timeouts or breaks and the necessary exercise, movement requirements are observed and carried out. Regular active timeouts or necessary breaks are absolutely essential, as this is the only way for the human being to remain motivated in the long term, as well as to maintain his or her energy level and sufficient power for everything necessary in everyday life, which undoubtedly requires energy and new power to be replenished after every strenuous completion of tasks and every phase of exertion. This can perhaps be done through a short walk, a brief meditation, sitting in the sun and spending a short break with sensible contemplation, or a few minutes of breathing exercises. If ideas appear in this way, then they can possibly be put to good use, but if they are needed, then a break can also serve to think up and create them through effectively valuable thoughts. Therefore, breaks can also be used to establish a regular and good rest period of sleep, which results in a valuable sleep routine and allows recovery as well as the easy buildup of energy and power. It is important for the human being that he or she gets to know and uses the consonants of his or her values and strengths in his or her entire existence, as well as learning how to live in such a way that he or she can use his or her strengths as much and in as many different ways as possible. However, all and everything is unavoidably connected with a good energy level and its power, which the human being has to consciously work out for himself or herself at all times in order to be able to use it consciously and well. If he or she sometimes feels tired and lacking in drive because he or she is currently unable to form his or her life in the way that would be good and successful for him or her, then, if he or she is conscious of his or her personal values and objectives, Zila, this knowledge can very well serve as a guide for his or her everyday life and be helpful to him or her in making better and even right decisions, as a result of which he or she can also gain more energy and power and handle everything in a progressive wise. In addition, it can very well be worthwhile for him or her to rightly recognize his or her personal energy level and get to know his or her strengths, as well as to use them more consciously in everyday life and to achieve successes that in turn bring him or her progress. It is therefore very important for the human being to know his or her own values and strengths, as this alone can already help him or her a great deal to build up a routine of movement and behavior through realistic thoughts that are suitable for him or her, and of which he or she thus becomes aware and comes to know what is effectively of importance to him or her in his or her life and existence, as well as what role he or she really plays or can play in his or her existence and in the world. If the human being is not yet aware of, or does not yet know exactly which movements, exercises, and activities, which of his or her thoughts and efforts of every conceivable kind, isintha, develop and enhance him or her physically and in terms of his or her energy level, as well as its power to the highest form, or cause him or her to break down, then it helps that he or she can certainly review the whole thing in such a wise, on-demand, and refresh his or her memory. He or she should therefore document everything in writing, including all the various activities during waking hours, and all the energy sources and their usage, as well as those factors that can be described as energy robbery or the like. It is thereby feasible to mark the written records with different colors, symbols or signs, etc., as well as to gradually elaborate on everything. In addition, this enables the human being to use the written recorded material in the next step to think about and discover by means of right thoughts why he or she can use certain movements of the body, these and those activities as well as thoughts for the general production of energy. This, while other things drain energy and rob the joy of living. In this way, he or she also recognizes things and modes of behavior, etc., that he or she shall eliminate, reduce, or completely banish from his or her life because they affect him or her in one form or another, by partially or completely impairing various areas of his or her life in such a wise that they choke off his or her potentials and rob him or her of his or her energy level and increasingly his or her strength and power. If the human being wants to increase his or her energy level and its power, then he or she shall set limits and priorities one way or another, and be conscious of the fact that every energy in its power has limits that cannot be exceeded. Energy alone and its power are indeed limited in and of themselves, and that is completely normal. However, the human being shall also be conscious of the fact that each, and therefore also his or her energy and power, has a certain amount of reserve, which is unknowingly automatically determined individually and is used in emergency situations. Science apparently knows nothing about this, because according to science there is no knowledge that every form of energy and its power is deposited mentally, physically and organically, and continues to have a direct and lasting effect in its own specific modality. This is namely also why surpluses energy and power accumulates in the human being and why, in an emergency, he or she is able to use this deposited energy and its power to achieve superhuman feats with energies and powers that go far beyond the normal energy level and the thereout resulting power. Thus it happens that, for example, in emergency situations, a human being can lift or hoist a weight that is several times his or her own body weight without being conscious of it. It is therefore very important for the human being to become aware of this and also to think very carefully about how he or she shall operate and behave rightly with regard to his or her spheres of life, thoughts, movements and activities, etc., so that he or she always creates his or her own necessary energy and power within himself or herself and uses and allows it to flow in the right measure at the right time without wearing themselves out. It is very important to prioritize the whole of the energy and power in terms of tasks, requirements, projects, and the important things that come up, and it shall be absolutely clear that this has to be done. Because projects often set limits in areas that have not been carefully considered, and therefore the human being would do better to forego their implementation. It is necessarily given that the human being uses daylight in general, as it plays a very important role in the circadian rhythm. For this reason, it is very important that the human being moves around in the daylight as much as possible and allows it to have an effect on his or her body. In the ideal case, he or she can start the day by getting up early and exercising, moving around in the fresh air, which is a valuable help in soaking up daylight already at an early hour, as well as regulating the internal clock. Physical and mental causes for the feeling of having no more energy often go hand in hand, especially when the human being does not feel morally fulfilled. Then the moment comes when he or she hastily reaches for things that are not good for him or her, such as food that is not rich in nutrients, which on the one hand he or she simply eats senselessly without really being hungry or otherwise needing it, but which on the other hand weighs him or her down and possibly makes him or her sleep worse or hinders him or her in his or her movements. All of this, however, can make the human being feel all the more tired and listless. The most common reasons for a low energy level are 1. Lack of sleep. 2. Too little daylight. 3. Excessive training. 4. Lack of exercise movement. 5. Too little break time. 6. No fulfillment in life. 7. Unbalanced diet. 8. Lack of self-value. 9. Lack of mindfulness. 10. Too little self-care. 11. No rest time in day-to-day life. 12. Too few micronutrients. 13. Undercalorized diet. 14. No rest period at work. 15. Lack of consonance with oneself. 16. Ignoring one's own internal clock. 17. Constantly striving for perfectionism. 18. Disregarding one's own values and strengths. 19. Demanding too high standards of oneself. Of course, there are many other reasons for the human being to feel weak, exhausted and listless, lacking in drive, such as when he or she is ill, has been ill, or is acutely struggling with some kind of malaise, unwellness. In such a case, it is therefore normal, so to speak, to feel weaker than usual, such that he or she feels exhausted and finds it difficult to concentrate. But he or she nevertheless has to increase his or her energy level and its power in order to become more efficient and more focused again. Consequently, the human being needs a new approach that will bring him or her up again mentally, physically, and organically, and allow him or her to return to the normal, healthy life and help him or her with all the required factors to be able to dedicate himself or herself to his or her normal course of life again. To do this, however, it is necessary for the human being to create more energy and power for the new uplifting of his or her mental, physical, and organic state, for which it is necessary that he or she consciously focuses his or her attentiveness on them once again and perceives them comprehensively. If the human being wants to increase his or her energy level and its power, then his or her heedfulness really helps him or her, because if he or she perceives and experiences everything better again, then he or she can find out which specific things, moments, and modes of behavior rob him or her of energy and power, as well as when and how he or she can renew and build them up again. In this process, walks, meditation, conversations, and breathing exercises, etc., can be helpful, as well as heedful and conscious reflections or valueful considerations. The human being can consciously train himself or herself to do all of these things so that in moments of need, he or she can immediately and always fall back on them to push aside his or her dark thoughts. The regularity of the necessary movements, exercise is important, and walking upright with a straight posture is very important, in which the use of walking sticks is to be avoided whenever possible. Sometimes at first this may feeling-wise seem counterintuitive in terms of pain, but often it is just sniveling or self-pitying that prevents one from walking normally without the use of walking sticks, canes. This also applies to physiotherapy in the same frame, which often brings no tangible benefits, but costs not just a lot of time and money, all of which could be saved if the self-initiative were taken in the right wise, and the necessary movements, exercises, and perhaps massages were carried out by the patient themselves. Without any sniveling self-pity and with the right initiative. However, this requires a healthy will, ability, and self-confidence. Otherwise, an appropriate professional physiotherapy is called for if it brings benefits. However, it is fundamentally the case that some human beings often feel lacking in motivation and tired. However, an active lifestyle with plenty of movement exercise, both mentally and physically, is indeed the right key to a full energy level and its power. This applies not only in everyday life at work, but also in one's free time, and especially then, because then one shall not simply mess around, but actively engage in mental and physical exercise movement. Small periods of active rest, which are used for walks or a few physical exercises, also promote circulation of blood in the body, as this can also improve the functions of the brain and supply it more advantageously with oxygen. However, this also allows the cells to work much better, which in turn allows the power plants to provide more energy. Primarily, it is not important to do a lot of movement exercise in the form that it is done continuously and uninterrupted, but rather that there are also periods of rest in between. The energy level and its power increase with the right use of movement exercise, and the right kind and form of movement creates a lot of energy and power, whereas the wrong activity can even become a real motivation robber. For this reason, on the one hand, it always depends on the measure, and on the other hand, also on the sensible and right form of the exercise movement activity. If basic endurance is built up in this way, then everything must be done with a measure and purpose, because this already changes the mental state, as well as the body. Then, however, many things actually change at the cellular level, just as the muscles also develop as a result of more mitochondria and new blood vessels, which in turn ensures a better supply of oxygen. Even the heart changes in some way, as well as its capability to deliver more oxygen to the body. Altogether, the body becomes capable of transporting more oxygen and at the same time is more efficient in utilizing it better. The result of this is that the human being is able to generate higher levels of performance, as well as to actually increase his or her energy level and its power and use them more efficiently. However, if the human being does too little and therefore neglects his or her necessary movements, then the stimuli for such an adaptation are also missing. However, if the human being overloads himself or herself mentally and physically with his or her movements, exercises, then no sufficient regeneration can take place because, as a rule, the energy and its power decrease mentally and physically. In order to increase the energy level and its power over the long term, a continuous movement activity and, in turn, a necessary pause time is required. A basic level of endurance is thus necessary, however. An intensive peak load should not be exceeded, including how long the human being shall recover from his or her movements, exercises. He or she shall pay attention to when the right time is for his or her movement, bar exercise activity, and his or her resting time, in order to manage his or her energy and its power as well as possible. A good night's sleep ensures a good energy level and full strength the next day, allowing the human being to manage his or her energy and power much better, and also increase his or her motivation for the necessary movements, exercises. However, nutrition also plays an important role here because this is also necessary for more energy and power. Food is another fundamentally essential factor in combating listlessness and fatigue, because only when the body and organism are supplied with sufficient nutrients, including enough calories, can it also provide a good level of energy and the resulting power. It is therefore necessary that sufficient food with enough calories is supplied to the body and organism, because energy and power are also generated through nutrition. The human being should always be attentive to the fact that permanent diets cannot provide the body with all the necessary and sufficient energy and power. A balanced diet that includes plenty of complex carbohydrates as well as sufficient proteins and unsaturated fats is required to maintain the body, the mental faculties, and the whole organism. The effect of carbohydrates should not be underestimated, especially when there is a lot of exercise and exertion. Normally, the human being needs the following in his or her diet. As far as possible, a variety of vegetables and fruit, as well as corresponding beverages. Micronutrients. Vitamins and trace elements are particularly relevant for the energy level, especially B vitamins, vitamin D, iron, magnesium, and coenzyme Q10. Avoid heavy meals and eat in keeping with the right mode of life. It is important to ensure regular bedtimes, where normally 7 to 8 hours of sleep per night is good and right. Advice as to when the right time is for the human being personally to go to sleep cannot be given, because that is up to the individual. This is because nowadays everything is different and is no longer as regulated as it was in olden times. And why a healthy and sufficient amount of sleep is so important is that it guarantees that everything can function properly. Regular periods of rest and really active downtimes are necessary for every human being, as this is the only way he or she can stay motivated and muster up enough energy and power for day-to-day life. As a result, he or she is able to assert himself or herself after strenuous phases or tasks of everyday life and is able to recover again and again. It is important that the human being takes regular breaks in everyday life and also has a good sleep routine. Living in consonance with all the values and using one's own strengths as much as possible, efficiently and in a diverse way, also provides a connection with one's own energy level and its power. As a result, the human being does not feel lacking in drive motivation, and he or she forms his or her life just the way that is good for him or her. If he or she also knows his or her own values and objectives, determination, zila, he or she can use them as a signpost and guide for his or her everyday life, and they can also help him or her to make better decisions. Through the whole process, he or she will also be able to gain more energy and power, just as he or she will be able to get to know his or her personal strengths and to consciously use them in every situation. Knowing his or her own values and strengths can even be helpful for him or her to build up a special exercise routine that is just right for him or her and personally tailored to him or her, and makes it clear to him or her what is really important in his or her life.
Simyase Silver Star Center, July 20th, 2023. Billy.